Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sesotris, and this week I wanted to talk about horror classics and whether or not these older books are still worth reading or if we should let them go in favor of newer books. First up on this list is Robert Louis Stevenson's novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I wanted to start with this one because this one, I think, almost more than any of the others, has sort of maybe lost its oomph. The novella is really well written. It's gripping. It's sort of a mystery novel is kind of how it's structured. And it's got gothic elements. But the twist at the end is always sort of the thing that we already know about the story. So we all know what the twist is. The twist is that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person, and that their personalities are the result of this experiment that Dr. Jekyll did that caused his soul to sort of split, and one side is noble and good and the other side is pure evil. And I've always kind of wondered, does this book still work today? Because like the character has shown up so many times. There's a Broadway musical version. The character has appeared in a ton of other things. We see him in like The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen in those comics and in the movie. And it's just one of those books where it's like I always find myself wondering, does it still work without the twist ending? Because we all know what the twist is. I'd have to say yes. The book still has so much to say about human nature and what makes people do bad things. And also, the way the book is set up is we follow a character named Utterson, who's sort of the detective character, and he's sort of trying to figure out what's going on. He suspects there's something going on with this doctor, and he sort of pieces together things slowly over time. And he sees Mr. Hyde at one point, and there's a really brutal moment where he sees him like attacking a child, and all the while he's trying to put together these pieces to find out, first off, who is this Dr. Jekyll person, what is he really doing, and then who is this Hyde character, and what seems to be the connection between the two. And over time he eventually puts it together, and then at the very end he finds a note that sort of explains everything. And the note is usually where every other adaptation of this story starts with. They usually have the character doing the kind of experiment closer to the beginning, and then the adaptation kind of follows him wrestling with his two sides of his personality and eventually reconciling them somehow. Robert Louis Stevenson, he also wrote Treasure Island. He's a really accomplished writer, and I think this is one where even if you know the twist ending and you know what's happening, it almost makes it more exciting to read, because you have this sort of, what the answer is, but we're following this Utterson character who's trying to figure things out. And so with that said, I do think that this book is definitely worth reading. It's short, it's really full of atmosphere, it's really interesting, and the big reveal at the end, even if you know what it is, it's still satisfying when you read it. So definitely don't discount this one. Next up on this list is another one that's sort of almost become cliche at this point, and I think people still need to read it, and that is Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is one of my favorite books of all time ever. I love it so much, and there's so much in the book version that you don't see in other adaptations. Dracula's probably most famous in movie versions. We've got the Bela Lugosi version in the 30s. We've got the Hammer version with Christopher Lee in the 50s into the 70s. And then we've also got the Francis Ford Coppola version with Gary Oldman. And I love all the versions almost equally. He's one of my favorite sort of literary characters. And one thing that I think every variation misses out on is the characters of Jonathan and Mina. And I think that's why people still need to read the book. Recently, I think it was last year, Dracula Daily started up for the first time. It went again this year, and I might even be behind myself. It might have even been 2 years ago. time doesn't matter anymore. But that one is a really cool project where, because this is a epistolary novel where it's comprised of letters, journal entries, newspaper clippings, that kind of stuff. And so what this is it's kind of like a subscription where they send you every day all the things in the book that happened on that day of the year. So you can kind of follow the story in real time throughout the year, and so you can read maybe like a few entries each day, and then it tells the story through the year. And one thing that a lot of people really glommed onto during the first Dracula Daily run through was the character of Jonathan, because he has such a good arc. He starts out sort of shy and unassuming. He's sort of taken prisoner by Dracula, and he's too polite to really fight back or to comment on any of it. So there's a lot of like huge red flags, and he's like, well, that is strange, but it would be impolite to be rude to the person who's being so hospitable by letting me stay at his place, kind of thing. And he undergoes sort of this really significant trauma near the beginning, and then spends the middle of the book sort of recovering from that and coming to terms with it. And then by the end of the book, Jonathan has become almost like this caped crusader vigilante, minus the cape, who's sort of determined to destroy Dracula and defend his new wife, because Dracula's kind of coming after Mina. And then all the way through this, you've got Mina as well, who starts out also very shy, polite, and through the story she sort of becomes the ringleader, the organizer, the archivist for the group of vampire hunters. She sort of organizes everyone. She's the one who is sort of the one who arranges all the letters and journal entries into the Book of Dracula. So she exists kind of in a meta sense. She's the one who sort of writes this book, and she also becomes sort of the leader. You've got Van Helsing, who's sort of the brains, but he's sort of strange, and she's the kind of level-headed, normal, she's like the mom friend. She's just the smart one who kind of keeps everyone in check. And so seeing Jonathan and Mina go from being kind of shy kids almost, and seeing them kind of grow up and become these like vampire hunters extraordinaire is so good, and very few adaptations, if any, get that right. The Francis Ford Coppola version is probably my favorite movie version of Dracula, and in that one they really don't get Jonathan and Mina right. They do get Mina, like, she has a lot of agency and she's an interesting character, but her version in the movie is still very different from the book version. And the Jonathan version in the movie, even though I love Keanu Reeves so much, he's still just kind of a shy, withering violet throughout the whole book. And we don't get to see him sort of become that sort of, you know, fire in his soul, determined to destroy Dracula kind of person. He even has like a signature weapon that he wields at the end, and it's so good. So Dracula, it will never go out of style. It's always being remade because people love this story so much. And this is one where I think the book is still the best version. There are a lot of really iconic movie versions, but the book version is still wonderful, and it's still worth reading. So please read Dracula and come on this page and just talk about how much you love it, because I always love to talk about this book with people who have read it. And I think Dracula Daily is now something that is probably going to keep going. I don't know if it's going this year or if it's just going to kind of be continuous, but people really enjoyed that, and you can always go back through the archive and kind of go through it yourself. It's a great way to read the book. So Dracula, don't discount it. It's wonderful. Next up on the list is one that I recently read in audio version, and I definitely want to get a hard version of it for my library, and that is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. And this one is really interesting. It's a short read. You can zip through it pretty quickly, but it really messes with the reader because you don't really know what's happening until right at the end. The characters are complex and strange and quirky, especially our main POV character. I love her so much. She's almost, I don't know if Shirley Jackson intended this, but she sort of reads as a bit neurodivergent. And for being written in the 50s, that's pretty ahead of the game. Now, I don't know how accurate her neurodivergency is to any actual sort of diagnosis, but the way that she sees things and the way that she organizes her thoughts and the way that she relates to herself, there's sort of this dissociation that's happening, is really compelling. And her story is really the one that you are sort of engaged with. The possibly haunted house is interesting, and the vibe and the kind of gothic ambiance, and there's sort of this malevolence that seems to be kind of in this house, but you can't really describe what it is compelling. But the main character is so unpredictable. She's so unhinged in the best way that she's kind of the reason why you're so pulled into the story, because you don't know what she's going to do next. And it really keeps you guessing right up until the end. I read this recently and I really, really loved it. Shirley Jackson's writing is immaculate anyways, and I think the first line of this book sort of stands the test of time as being one of the greatest first lines in literature ever. But definitely would recommend this one. You have to be patient with it, but it is a short book, so it's not like a huge long commitment. But you do have to be patient with it, because if you're used to maybe the movie version, there was a movie version of this in I think 99, that was a lot more sort of explicit, there's something in the house and it's coming to get you kind of thing. It was kind of more along the lines of sort of a classic slasher sort of thing, with a group of people in a house and they get picked off one by whatever's living in this house. But in this one, it's more about they're trying to uncover whether the house is haunted and what is haunting it. And so the mystery is sort of what is at the heart of this strange house. And it's just so compelling. The way that Jackson writes is amazing. Another element about this book that I think really worked for me was the characters feel very modern. It was written in the 50s, but it really doesn't read like it. There's even one character who's sort of implied to be sort of sapphic. We don't really know the extent of it, but it just feels very compelling and modern, and it's treated with a nuance that you don't often see in the 50s. Whenever you did have queer characters show up in books around that time, they were usually sort of punished at some point, and even if it was a noble end, they usually died somehow. And this book sort of subverts a lot of those tropes. So I really appreciated what she did with that. Would definitely recommend this one, and it's one that I definitely want to get a copy of for myself because I really enjoyed it. Next up on the list is another book that I think people probably used to see as being sort of overexposed and cliche because it was sort of everywhere, but we haven't seen a lot of adaptations of this recently. And I feel like this is a book that people really need to give another chance, because we have had some adaptations of it and none of them have really captured what makes the book compelling. I would love to see like a TV miniseries version of this that really digs into sort of the depth of what it's exploring, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I know probably the most famous version of this is the James Whale movie version from the 30s. Kenneth Branagh did a really strange version in the 90s where it was kind of sort of in the same vein as Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola, where it was trying to be sort of accurate to the book and very gothic and lay into kind of the Victorian elements, and it almost gets it. It's good for like the first 2/3, except for kind of one really odd moment when he kind of activates the creature for the first time is so over the top that it's almost funny, but you can forgive it because it's, you know, it's well directed. But then it gets to the final third and it just goes off the rails, and it's like it just can't help itself from just being so ridiculous and over the top. I still have a soft spot in my soul for that movie version. I don't know if it's necessarily good, but it is entertaining. But the book is one that I think we just need to keep reading because it's so compelling and it's so well written. Much like Dracula, this one is sort of an epistolary novel, and there's 3 POV characters, and it's a nesting perspective kind of thing. So we start off following a ship captain who's exploring the Arctic, and then he picks up Victor Frankenstein, who tells him the story of his life and how he created the creature. And then we get to a certain point where the creature confronts Victor in his story and tells Victor his story. And so we get the creature's story kind of in the center of the book, and then it backs out a bit and we get the end of Victor's story, and then it backs out again and we get the end of the ship captain's story. And so it's a really elegantly structured book, and I think the beginning can throw some people off because we're following a character who really doesn't show up in a great many adaptations of the story, and he's not sort of one of these like iconic pop culture icons, but you really need to kind of stick with it because the character of Victor Frankenstein is so interesting. He's so insecure, he's trying to prove something, but he doesn't really know what it is, and then when he finally proves it, he's terrified by what he creates, and the byplay between him and the creature, there's just so many layers, and this also has some kind of queer subtext to it. I don't know how explicit Shelley was intending to be with that, but it is there, and it adds a lot to the story, and I really love articles that are kind of like breaking down the story, looking at it from a queer perspective, because there's some really cool facets of the story that you can kind of uncover if you look at it that way. And again, it doesn't really matter what the author intended if the book has enough depth that you can read into it different perspectives, especially modern perspectives that really wouldn't have been around in Shelley's time. There wouldn't have been a ton of explicitly queer literature at the time. Own voices wasn't really a thing back then, but it really adds a lot to the story. So this is one that I think people need to move past kind of the preconceptions of what they think the story is and just dive into it, because it will not disappoint you. This is a wonderful, wonderful book. It's definitely one of my favorites. And not only is it one of the great Gothic novels, but it's also one of the first science fiction novels. This is very much a sci-fi novel in the vein of like Jurassic Park, that kind of story, the hubris of science without thought behind it. And I know a lot of people tend to give credit to H.G. Wells and Jules Verne for kind of inventing science fiction, but we all need to give Mary Shelley her due. She created science fiction. I know there was sci-fi-ish stories before this, but this is very much kind of the first sci-fi novel in that it's looking at a scientific process and then exploring the ethics of that scientific process, rather than it being sort of a fantasy in space sort of thing like you see before this. But Frankenstein is amazing. It's a classic for a reason. It doesn't deserve to get lost in the mists of time. Definitely give this a read. And if you have read it, I'd love to hear your thoughts of this. This is a book that I've read a million times, and I always love hearing other perspectives on the story. Next up on the list is another science fiction novel, and that is The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells has a number of sort of more famous stories. He did like The War of the Worlds and The Invisible Man, and this is one that I don't see talked about a lot, and I've talked about it before on this channel because I really, really enjoy this book. But The Island of Dr. Moreau, it's a short one. It's so interesting. This is where you get sort of, this also has kind of a Jurassic Park feel, where you've got this scientist who thinks that he can civilize animals by giving them human characteristics. And so he creates an island of sort of animal-human hybrids. In the book, he uses what's called vivisection, which is basically just surgery on them while they're alive. In the movie version from the 90s, which I also really like, it's sort of modified to be genetic engineering, and I think that works really well too. But of course, you've got this island where this doctor, he thinks that he can control nature by civilizing it, and of course that doesn't work. The creatures turn against him, and you're left with kind of this really tense, dangerous island filled with these animal people who don't have a concept of like government or structure or culture, because they were sort of created whole cloth from animals instead of growing up in a culture where they could be raised. So it's kind of nature versus nurture, and the main character is sort of an observer of this who gets sort of trapped on this island. It's tense, it's scary, it's really compelling, and it has lots to say about human nature and science and everything. H.G. Wells is a genius, and this is definitely a book that I would recommend. If you haven't read any of his work before, this is definitely one that I would say you need to read. And also, if you have read this, you should then check out Sylvia Moreno Garcia's The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, because this is sort of a retelling of this, but it's set in Mexico in the 1920s. And it sort of changes up the story a little bit, but it's really compelling and interesting. Next up on the list is another vampire novel, and that is Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. And this one predates Dracula. This came out before that one. And this one is also really interesting. This has all kinds of kind of sapphic undertones that I think made it a little racy for its time. This was very loosely adapted in the sequel to Bela Lugosi's Dracula movie, Dracula's Daughter, which is a very different story, but they kind of took inspiration for the main character from this book here. This has a woman who's staying at this kind of spooky castle, and there's this female vampire who's there, and she kind of develops this strange hold over this woman, and the relationship between them is strange and very toxic, and she has to kind of find a way to kind of escape from this. This is another short one, and this one is in the public domain, so you can find it anywhere. You could probably even read it for free online, but would definitely recommend this one. The atmosphere in this one is really interesting. It has kind of an impressionistic writing style where everything feels like you're seeing it through sort of a mist, and you're not quite sure what's happening until you get deeper into the story. But it's really compelling. The language is interesting, the characters are interesting, and this kind of has a little bit more horror bite to it than Dracula does. Dracula is full of the ambiance that we see in kind of gothic novels, but it's got a little bit more adventure to it, because you've got these characters who are sort of hunting Dracula and trying to uncover what's going on. This one is all atmosphere and all kind of gothic horror ambiance, and so this is definitely an underrated classic of the vampire genre, and you should really check it out. Next up on the list is one that I don't often see categorized as horror, but I think I could fit it in that, and that is The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Now, this is science fiction. It details an alien invasion of Martians to Earth, but the way that it's told feels more like a gothic novel than it does a science fiction sort of action story. If you're looking at The Time Machine by the same author, that one feels more actiony. It feels more, let's play around with this concept and explore things, and there's things you're running away from. But this one, the way it's written, is the main character is sort of observing the aftermath of the Martian invasion. So a lot of the story is him walking through ruined cities, kind of observing the horror of what these Martians have done to the planet and what they've done to people. There's a few moments that are more sort of tense action jump scare moments, and there's one very creepy scene where he sees how the Martians feed, and what they do is they drain the blood of their victims, and so it's very creepy. But this is very much, it feels more like a horror novel than it does kind of a science fiction action novel. And movie versions of this always sort of lean more towards the action adventure part of it. I think the Steven Spielberg version gets into the horror elements the best, but it does still have sort of more action scenes. There's that really iconic scene in the movie early on where the Martian tripod rises out of the street and starts zapping people, and there's people running, and it's very much sort of draws on this like 9/11 iconography to show like the ground level people dealing with a disaster. And it's great, and it's really well shot, and I do genuinely like that movie. And then there's the 50s version, which is much more action adventure. It's all about, running away from explosions and everything. But the book is a lot more creepy and a lot more about atmosphere, because a lot of the stuff is happening in the distance, or it's happening kind of in the past, and then the main character arrives after everything's happened, and all he sees are like dead bodies and ruined cities, and he's walking through it kind of commenting on, you know, how on earth can they fight back against these things that are so powerful. And so I would definitely recommend this one. It's a little bit slower paced than a lot of the movies, but it's fine. It still works. The atmosphere keeps it engaging. The description of the Martians is alien and really creepy. There's one wonderful moment where he's like with his horse going down the road at night, and there's a storm and there's a bolt of lightning, and in the flash of lightning he realizes one of the tripods is like stepping into the road right in front of him, and he didn't see it until that moment. And it's just one of the best moments. It's one of those ones where like you're reading it and you can see it in your mind's eye so clearly, and it's sort of stuck with me ever since I first read it as a kid. So War of the Worlds, sci-fi horror, would recommend. And then finally on the list is one that I think people just need to move past their preconceptions of it, because I think pop culture has turned it into something else. And that is The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. The musical that everyone is most aware of, even the title, even the cover of this book, is the poster for the musical version by Andrew Lloyd Webber. And there's other musical versions. There's the great one from the 90s. There's tons of movie adaptations. There's a mini series. There's so many adaptations of this that have kind of turned it into something else. Now, there is also the really incredible Phantom Saga series by Jessica Mason that sort of takes it, it focuses more on the romance of it and kind of digs into a lot of the characters, and that is excellent. I genuinely really love that series. But the original is much more of a slasher type horror kind of thing. It's sort of written as a mystery. It's also written as being something that's like based on true events, and someone is like assembling all the real facts to kind of uncover what really happened. But the Phantom in this one is much darker, much scarier, much more dangerous, and it has sort of a more tense, scary climax than I think we see in a lot of other versions. I think the Andrew Lloyd Webber version gets close to it, but this version, unlike a lot of others, does not really set up the Phantom as a sympathetic character. He's like a tortured character that you can understand, but he's still a bad guy. And this one makes no doubt about the fact that he is dangerous. He's the villain of this book, and the story is all about getting Christine, the main character, sort of away from him in a way that she stays alive, kind of thing. But the atmosphere in this one is great. This is an iconic book for a reason. It went out of print for a long time, and that makes me so sad, because this book is incredible, and I'm really glad that we have different musical versions that kind of brought it back into the public eye, because this book is a ton of fun. So would recommend this one. It's very different from any other adaptations, so when you're reading it, you do have to kind of just disconnect your brain from the other stuff that's happening in your memory of other versions, and just sort of appreciate it for its own thing as it is. And also, if you do appreciate the sort of more romance aspect of it, and you want sort of a gothic romance take on the story, Jessica Mason's Phantom Saga is amazing. It's so good. I read it recently. It also has a companion novella, and I think she is continuing the series sort of past the events of the book. So that trilogy of books sort of covers the events of this roughly, and it modifies some things, but then she's continuing the series going forward. So that's another really good adaptation that I think is excellent. But The Phantom of the Opera is a favorite. It's been a favorite of mine for a very long time, and this is one that every time I read it, I find something else in it that I didn't notice before, and it just makes it that much more exciting. So this is definitely one that rewards rereading. I know right now we're seeing a ton of modern horror by some really incredible authors, and when you're looking at your TBR and it's like 1,000 books deep, and you know, of course, if you only read horror during like fall, early winter, you have kind of a limited amount of time. So don't feel pressured to like, you know, throw away all the current books that you're reading and read these instead. Everyone reads what they want when they want. But these are books that are sort of, they're classics for a reason, and we need to not let them fade into obscurity. Even though we're reading a lot of newer stuff, we need to kind of stick to our roots and appreciate the classics because they led us where we are today. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.